No need Well, hello and welcome everybody that is here to our Zoom with Miss Nicole Moore here from the Center for Civil and Human Rights. So excited and thank you for coming. I know that you are very, very busy. So taking your time out of your day. After this Zoom has concluded, it will be available on YouTube, and that's where the rest of our webinars will stay for future reference in case you need it. So I go ahead and do the bio for Nicole. So Nicole Moore is a public historian and consultant with over 10 years of museum experience, including interpreting the lives of the enslaved, bridging the gap between the first and third person interpretation for all age groups. Nicole has conducted training sessions at historic sites across the Southeast and has done workshops, including best practices for interpreting enslavement and the impact of race and identity on visitor learning. She has also consulted with historic sites on the development and implementation of interpretive plans and serves as a programmatic partner with the Homage exhibit and a collection of over 600 artifacts from the private collection of Nia and Morris McAdoo. And I hope I said that right. Nicole is the Director of Education at the the National Center for Civil Rights in Atlanta, where she is leading a multi-year expansion of educational content developed by and for the center, engaging audiences that range from K through 12 to Fortune 500 C-suite executives and professional sports teams. Nicole urges groups to seek ways to protect the civil and human rights of all. And also Nicole is a board secretary for the Slave Dealing Project, a past board member and now active member of the National Council on Public History and active member of the American Association for State and Local History. Her publications include chapters for interpreting slavery and interpreting the Civil War for museums and historic sites, as well as Radical Roots, Public History, a tradition of social justice and activism. Thank you so much, Nicole. And of course, if you want to add to your fabulous bio, you are.
No, you covered it well. And I'm really excited to be here in this capacity as a public historian, really, that has dealt with enslavement, talking about the Black family from enslavement to today, and really creating those connections for people who are like, I don't know why I should care or I don't want to, when it's so important for us to know our history, to embrace our history, our triumphs, as well as our struggles, and see where we've come from, but also to see the impact of our history on who we are today. And part of that, we'll talk a little bit about when we talk about ghost genes and when we're talking about the trauma that has been passed down generationally through enslavement. But today, we are gonna share my screen. We are looking at the history of Black men and families in America. And again, Renee, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. This is really spectacular. One of the things that we'll do is just kind of a rundown, y'all. It's a lot, but it's interesting. We're looking at really the legacy of enslavement and slavery and how that has impacted Black men and Black families, how that carries over to civil rights, then our contemporary issues today, where we want to build resilience, and then the intersectionality pieces that we have. So shout out to Black Community Health and Wellness Association for having me out here to do this seminar with y'all tonight. I'm very excited. They're devoted to providing that culturally competent health services and resources to improve the health of those that they serve. And really getting into the work of this is really kind of understanding who we are as a people, how has our history impacted us, not just in terms of who we are socially, but also who we are health-wise. Some of the stuff that was really interesting when we were kind of talking about this idea and this history and understanding the history of Black men and the family in America was really understanding the impact of enslavement, and how that is carried forth. When we think about slavery, when we think about that time period, a lot of people don't know that it was a matrilineal passage. So the child of an enslaved person followed the status of the mother. The men weren't able to protect their families. They weren't able to really claim their families. They were just there. We know that as a community, we built community and we built family and we built partnerships within this institution, but a lot of it hinged on the roles of women. A lot of it hinged upon the ability of women. And so what often gets lost a little bit in the narratives are the roles of Black men in the family during this time period, which has led to a lot of the stereotypes that people see today. But they don't realize that men, even though the system of enslavement followed the line of the mother, again, meaning that the status of the child followed the status of the mother, they weren't understanding that the role of men were largely as field hands, artisans, blacksmiths, but also those that were looked at as studs, breeders. And so they were really just seen for physically what they could do in terms of creating increase for enslavers. And you have this not just this dehumanization that's happening within the system of enslavement, but also this knocking down of masculinity and really kind of tearing apart the role of a man as a protector, a man as a leader in these families. And we don't really we don't really think about that. We don't look at that. We just often assume, oh, well, they were there. But to understand how a man could father children whom he could not call his own, who he could not protect from sale, from having a wife or a partner that he cannot protect from sexual assault and rape, who did not know from one day or another if their family was going to be separated from them. It gets you to really kind of think about, wow, what was happening? What was going on in that aspect? What is really kind of the truth and the root of some of the what I quote unquote issues that we see in our community, because a lot of people just dismiss it as an issue and not realize that these are rooted in history, these are rooted in systemic oppression, these are rooted in, excuse me, in racism. And so it was really kind of interesting talking about, as we look at the role of Black men in this country from enslavement through modern day, kind of that impact. There's a lot that folks just don't realize. They just make these assumptions. But when you understand that even within the system, which was enslaver, maybe a plantation mistress, men, and then enslaved women and children, even though they are still sitting kind of in that middle ground because they are men, they're still not given opportunities, they're still not given respect, and they're still not given their humanity, which does have a lasting effect. And so when we think about enslavement, a lot of times people just think about usually the American South. They're not understanding that the system of enslavement covered the country, north to south, east, moving out west. They don't realize that this was not just in a rural setting or in a large plantation setting. These were in urban areas. These were in your cities. These were in your ports. These were everywhere. And so when we think about what the impact and the legacy of slavery was and what it means, it's not just the South. It touches every part of our industry. It touches every part of our country. It's looking at how we're built. And it's also looking at how we, and particularly Black men, have been treated through time. So when we think about the end of enslavement, but we also think about chain gangs, you're seeing a lot of men. You're seeing a lot of men whose labor constitutionally was told that, hey, you can't have somebody laboring for free. So then what they'll do is convict leasing and convict labor. And you'll see that these are separating people from their families because we lose this free-for-all workforce, if you will, largely based on the backs of Black men. And they're still trying to carry that through. When I think about like these legacies and I think about the impact of today, and I think about how we talk about the Black family or how we talk about broken homes or fatherless children, it always kind of rattles me because it's so easy to be dismissive without understanding the how and the why, and how long this had been going on, and how easy it is to continue to create systems of oppression if you are separating, if you are dehumanizing, if you are constantly putting people down. It looks at how we are able to advance economically. Even those that were able to own land after enslavement still faced a lot of struggles because of who they were. When we think about lynchings in the early 20th century, and we think about the men who were killed protecting their families, trying to create and provide for their families, we don't really think about how that trauma has carried over through generations. It's really, it's heartbreaking that we would be so dismissive. And it's heartbreaking that we don't ask more why. How did we get here? How does that happen? And so when we're thinking about this impact of slavery on the Black families, we are looking at these pieces of the intergenerational trauma. We're looking at the economic inequality and the disparities that existed. We're looking at family separation and that systemic racism and the cultural erasure. We're not understanding how, by not knowing and not talking honestly about our history, how much we then contribute to the erasure of who we were as people, who we are as people. And I always tell people when I'm doing interpretation, they're always asking me about the trauma and the negative and the horror. And what I do is I bring in the joy and the resilience. I bring in the in spite of. And people think that that's ignoring all of the things. But even in the way that we talk about our ancestors, we only focus on the trauma that was inflicted upon them. And we don't talk about the culture that they brought. We don't talk about the traditions that we still hold on to. We don't talk about how the role of men helped build schools, how they helped lead freedom fights, how they helped keep us going. And the one thing that we don't realize is that that's part of the impact of the legacy of enslavement. We're never gonna, we don't tend to focus on who they were as people, who they were before they were enslaved. And for those that were born into enslavement, who they were in spite of. We don't think about the families that were separated, but they might have had a pass at Christmas and they would do what they can. These men would do what they can to go find their families and to spend even a few days with their families. We don't think about that moment that probably came in a time of despair, of the joy and the excitement of having just even 5 minutes together. And it's almost as if we don't recognize that in spite of, there was joy, in spite of, there were men who fought for their families. There were men who fought to protect those that they loved, whether it be blood or community. We don't think about that. And I think that's one of the impacts of enslavement and, again, passing down that trauma, is we never want to dismiss the horrors, but we also have to remember that these were human beings who, even in their darkest days, found a way to laugh to keep from crying, found a way to survive when they weren't expected to. And so when I look at things like the intergenerational trauma, I think about how we talk about the enslaved, particularly the enslaved men. I think about how we frame their narratives. And I think about what we're missing from our discourse today that would help explain a little bit of the why. I think about what it means to support and to take care of a family. And even moving outside of enslavement into Reconstruction, post-emancipation, how hard it was for men to find work, how hard it was for them to be treated with dignity to not be called boy when they're fully grown men, and the impact of that as they are striving and still trying to um, provide. I think about the men who looked for their families after, in the years after, who put ads in papers, who wanted nothing more than to be with their loved ones. And I think about how we started to, by not talking about this, started to erase some of those cultural pieces that we didn't even know existed, even if it's social culture. I always tell people, like, sitting out on the stoop and hanging out, talking. A lot of that comes from the enslaved communities where on a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday when they weren't laboring, if you have a row of cabins, people are going to be out on those stoops. They're going to be out talking. They're going to be out fellowshipping with each other because this is one of the very few moments that they have together. This is one of those moments where they can really be family, where they can be together, where they can share, where they can come together. And we don't think then about those psychological effects that happen and how that trauma, it has been studied, how that trauma does get passed down. So we think about people not understanding who they are culturally. We've seen a lot lately of people going back to the continent and doing return trips because they're searching for identity and they're searching for who they are, not understanding that you can have that identity as well, but you can also really discover who your people were here. What were they doing here? How does that culture evolve here? We think about the internalized racism, where they really do start to believe the hype that Black men in particular, they're lazy, they don't want to work, or they're criminals or they're thugs, not realizing that that is language and those are ideals that were passed down through enslavement to keep Black men oppressed and to keep them really kind of behind. It's one of those things where if you don't think about it in those ways, you don't realize like the impact. It's one of those things of how people don't want to talk about it because they're only thinking about the negative. And they're only thinking about how men were subjectified and how they were, reduced to how folks were broken down, how they were broken. But they don't think about those that did resist and refuse to be broken. And so it's really interesting diving into kind of that history and really thinking about it. Now, one of the things that we had talked about while we were prepping for this, and some of the research that I want to get more into, is this idea that you have ghost genes, but you also, let me back up, I'm sorry, but you also have the trauma that changes your genetic makeup. And at first, when I heard about this, they were tying it to enslavement. They were saying slavery can change your genetic makeup. I was like, wow, I felt like that was a reach. But there were people doing the research and they were saying, no, look at this. Look at how it has changed who we are. Look how it affected our DNA. And I was like, wow, that is deep. And it's the trauma of it. There are some folks who beaten, bruised, battered, broken down so much that trauma changed not only who they were, but generations after them. And it's not this, oh, it's all in your head or it's made up. Like, this is science. And when we start to understand a little bit deeper, well, why is X, Y, and Z prevalent in this community? Why is it prevalent with these people? Instead of just saying dismissively, oh, it's because they don't want to, is there something that has happened genetically that has changed who we are as a people? And shouldn't we be learning about that so that we can truly understand not just the economic and the social impacts of enslavement, but what that has done to us physically? What has that done to us in our health? What has that done to us? And what is that going to do for future generations? And is there a way to change that? Is there a way that we can break that level of trauma? Is there a way that we can understand the impact of what it meant for a man to lose his family, to lose, and when I say control, I don't mean like I need to run things, I have to control this. I mean to lose that control to exist as a protector, as a leader, as a provider, stemming from this era. Like, do we think about that? Do we talk about that? Do we want to understand then how, what is it that we could be doing in our communities today to kind of create a shift, if that's even possible? We're jumping through history though. So you kind of see the spaces of enslavement and the brutalization, the dehumanization, and then we look at men as leaders during the civil rights movement. So I'm jumping. I realize I'm jumping. But when we think about what is the brutality of enslavement, the terror that is Reconstruction leading through the Gilded Age, which a lot of people think, oh, fancy houses, and they're thinking about the HBO series. And for me, I'm thinking about the rise of Red Summers. I'm thinking about the terrorism and the rise of the Klan. I'm thinking about the brutalization, murder, and lynching of Black men, particularly, as well as Black women, but the terror that existed and how, again, men are, they're targeted because if you can tear down, if you can take down, if you could destroy the man, the thought was that you could destroy the family. Not realizing that Black women were not having none of that and were holding it down as well, but often seeing the men being targeted and understanding what that has done to us, to then having this constant resistance and this pushback, which leads then to civil rights era of the 50s. Civil rights, I always tell people, didn't start when Martin Luther King had a dream, didn't start when Rosa refused to give up her seat on the bus. That's more of the modern movement that people are aware of, but civil rights started with abolition. Civil rights had been a movement. But for our purposes, the civil rights era that we're talking about is the modern movement of the 50s and the 60s. Also going to caveat that the movement is ongoing. It never stopped. It just evolved. And so we start to see kind of this progress of civil rights, social justice, racial equality, eventually economic equality. These become the pillars of the movement. And it's led a lot by the men. It is an interesting place of history to really think about what the role of men were, not realizing that so many women were behind the scenes, organizing, strategizing, leading, but because of the era and because, let's be honest, sexism prevalent, you don't hear about the stories of women, but you do hear about the stories of the men and how they're uplifted. And I always get people to realize that the women weren't behind, they were next to. But understanding how our society worked, it needed to be the voice of men that were being heard in order to push change. And that is why you have a lot of your leaders, like Dr. King, like Abernathy, like all of these leaders of the Big Six, Whitney Young, John Lewis, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, I'm starting to forget names, but all of these men are highlighted as figures because they are there to lead. They're leading our churches, they're leading our schools. While women are teachers in normal schools, in the public schools, when we look at universities, when we look at colleges and places of higher education, men are leading those places, they're leading businesses. It's a shift. It's a little bit of a shift because there is this empowerment that has taken place. It is understanding and knowing that they are one or two generations removed from not even being recognized as human beings to being in positions of power that could elicit change. But it's also then again putting families at risk. Because if you can take out, again, there's this thought that if you can take out the men, you can deconstruct a movement. Again, not realizing that women are leading these organizations as well, that they are spearheading a lot of these initiatives, but that focus on men, that focus on particularly a Black man as a threat to the things that we hold dear, and the values of our country. Again, air quotes on that. It's really interesting when we think about that, when we think about how much progress was made, and how women supported those men in those actions because they knew that their voices weren't, not saying it was right, their voices weren't going to be heard on a grander scale, but they also knew that in order to get things to be moved forward, they had to uplift, support, stand by, stand beside, sometimes even be pushed behind the men to make this happen. When we think about then our leaders and how they're removed from their families for the greater good of the Black community because they are traveling and they are marching and they're doing this work, we're not thinking about the families that were left behind on the home front because of the threats brought against them. Because in some of the places they were going, the Klan was still prevalent. It's still prevalent. And there were danger and there were threats. And so you have then men who are who now have a chance to not just support, protect, guide, and care for their families, but really protect their families in the sense of, I don't think y'all can go with me today. You need to stay back. I don't know what's going to happen, or I know what might happen, and I don't want to put you in harm's way. And so you have the ability to then protect your family, something that couldn't be done during enslavement, something that was done but was hard to do in the era of lynching. And so when you move into the civil rights era and you see more of these leaders and you see the men really being able to take meetings with presidents, take meetings with senators and with leaders of communities and labor unions and be in these elevated spaces that they were denied just a generation earlier, you surely start to see that shift. And there's a bit of an empowerment. It feels good. It made some men feel like, yo, I finally arrived, like we made it. I think it's important that we think about how the image of men had changed as well. That increased political empowerment. Here's one thing, I'm gonna take it all the way back. The one thing that people don't realize when we think about the civil rights movement and we think about like voting rights and civil rights, Black men had the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. During the period of Reconstruction, when Black men were empowered to have their vote, they utilized it, they exercised it, so much so that Black folks put 1,500 men into office during this period of Reconstruction, which is why we ended up with the boomerang effect of mass lynching afterwards, because the Klan and Southern whites who had once held on to the seats of power, who no longer had them, they basically lost it. And so here we have then the civil rights movement, again, kind of pushing back against the things that they had lost in that moment, pushing back against it and giving them that political empowerment. It's going to come later, like in the 70s and 80s, where you start to see more Black folks, particularly Black men, represented in political office, but they're pushing forward. The movement is also helping create those greater opportunities economically. One of the things that people don't realize about the March on Washington, it wasn't just the March on Washington, it was for jobs and freedom. There was a large economic push that those leaders, those men were trying to push for. It wasn't just, we also want to eat at these lunch counters, we also want to be treated like human beings. It was, we need to make a livable wage. We need to be able to support our communities. We need to be able to be financially stable. We too want the American dream. How do we get that? It was helping push better educational opportunities. If you can get into colleges, if you can get into business, you have the ability to better support your families when, society is basically saying that you can't and that you're less than. But this idea to push forward for better educational opportunities, which then can lead into better economic opportunities, which gives you positions of power, which gives you a seat at the table, which gives you the ability to create the table. These are the things that we're starting to see with the movement and how it's helping Black men regain some of those things that maybe they never lost internally, but socially were taken away from them because of oppression and systemic racism, because of threats of violence. They're able to regain that sense of protection, that sense of I lost my thought, but they're able to be what maybe their grandfathers couldn't be, not because they didn't want to, but because they may not have lived long enough to be that. You see how the movement is bringing families closer together. Maybe within the same households, I will say as another caveat, generationally, the movement was, you always had the younger generation who wanted to push back and rebel a little bit harder than the elders. And then you saw that cycle back. So, you have the kings of the day. Daddy King was doing his thing. And he, his son is starting to do things. He's like, hey, y'all might want to slow down a little bit. And Martin Luther King Jr. is like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to push forward. We're going to move these things. But then when you see him interacting with SNCC and the generation after him, he's like, whoa, what are y'all doing? And you kind of see that generation of, now that I understand what it was like, maybe I don't want my kids to fight that battle this way. Maybe you should do it this way. And so you're starting to see these family bonds either strengthen, like really strengthen and commit to cause, but also kind of evolve how that work is done, because once they've experienced the things that their elders experienced, they're like, is there a better way? Is there a different way? How can we do this? But you start to kind of see those bonds of, wow, y'all went through it. We're gonna keep moving so that maybe the next generation doesn't have to go through it as much. We start to see the resilience and the generations build up. So when they were trying to tear us down and you still have that generational trauma that would be passed down, you also are starting to see this buildup of resilience. You start to see young men standing in for their fathers and saying, you can't do this, Dad, because you might lose X, Y, and Z. So I'm going to do it because I don't have it to lose right now. And you see that build upon, and you start to understand how they started to push back, how they started to regain what was taken from them, and how we still fight that fight today. I hope I am making sense. I hope I am making sense. When we're thinking, though, about what the role of men, of these Black men were in the movement, again, open any history book, you're going to see their faces. They are the leaders. They are in leadership roles. They are our lawyers in courts. They are our first Black Supreme Court justice. They are our organizational leaders. They are helping move the causes forward. They're our advocates. They're going to use their platform, their voices. They're going to use their sheer being men to really help elevate and push, because again, sexism's still a thing. You may not listen to a woman, but you will listen to a man. And so they're going to utilize that, hopefully for good, but not everybody was fighting the good fight for the good fight. They're going to be our educators, they're going to be our allies, and they're going to be our mentors. And you see that mentorship piece really strong today. You see how important it is for younger generations to have somebody to look up to, and how you'll always kind of see the call for big brothers, men as mentors, and you'll see all of that, and you'll see it hyped up. It should be, but it's also really important that we acknowledge that Black women were doing this work as well. Other marginalized groups were doing this work as well. They are often overlooked. And that speaks more to gender roles than it does to their impact. So when we think about what it means to kind of uplift our men, we have to remember that to uplift them doesn't mean that we have to tear down, that we have to hide or suppress someone else. But we know that through time, because the way that Black men have been treated, it is important to continue to lift, to support, to stand beside. I will never say stand behind. You're going to stand beside. You're going to be there to support. But understanding that that's a balance, because their uplift shouldn't come at the cost of somebody else. So we talked about a little bit about the men, but I always say that the women were right there, because Dr. King didn't exist without his wife. A lot of these men, their wives were right there with them. And it's understanding that you don't have to be in the, historically, women ended up in the background because, again, sexism. But it's not that they weren't sitting home and not doing anything. They were supporting, they were out speaking, they were out passing the messages, they were doing the work as well in support of the men who are leading these movements. And it is something that, like we say, it's not mutually exclusive. It can coexist in various ways within the society. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. But I think it's really important to understand that the struggles that Black men have faced throughout our history, I mean, they're valid. And a lot of these men may not have been able to go on had it not been for the women in their lives that helped support them, that pushed them forward, that said, nah, you got to keep going. There's a light at the tunnel. I see it. Let's go. And it's important that we highlight that, because you needed that. When the Klan is breathing down your throat, like, you need somebody in your corner saying, nah, we ain't about that. Let's go. We got this. And so really the women being able to push and support as they're fighting for their own recognition, as they're fighting for their own voices to be heard, often kind of sacrificing themselves so that the men can have their voices heard. Like, I think that's super important to understand that sacrifice. And it's not because the women couldn't do it. It's just they realized what it was. They realized what society was. So how are we going to move our message forward? We can do it in this way. So I think that's really a key point that people miss, because it's not as if women weren't doing the work again. And it's not as if they were just sitting back and being docile. But they also realized, well, this is our society. How do we help move things forward? How do we help support? How do we help the next generation live? This is the way that we make it happen. So when we're thinking about, then what does that leave us with today? These contemporary issues, we think about, all right, if we talked about the legacy of enslavement and how that created some generational trauma, if we're looking at the terror of Reconstruction and lynching in the early 20th century, and then we're looking at the leadership that comes through during the Civil Rights Movement, like, where are we today? And so we're dealing with now is just it's the impact of systemic racism on Black men and the families. We're looking at the school to prison pipeline. We are looking at unjust drug laws that are locking up our men for very minor infractions. We are looking at how that then leads to well, if you were convicted of a felony, then maybe you can't get a job that'll support your family, or you can't have these things. And so we're looking at how it's almost as if there are, like, it's these waves, right? We push through to get emancipation. We push through during Reconstruction to get these seats of power, just to lose it, to be terrorized. We push through again, civil rights, and we're fighting this just to have something else, the war on drugs, um, thrown at us, thrown at our communities, thrown at our men, to really kind of like say, no, 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 y'all can't have nice things. And we don't think about, oh, when we talk about the system and we're talking about systemic racism, that's what we're talking about. It's etched into that. And that leads us to economic inequality. So that leaves us with limited employment opportunities, not the best education, not the best housing, these income levels, the disproportionate pay, even between Black and white men. So you're seeing that. We're thinking about the health disparities. How many of you know an older Black man in your life that does not trust the doctor, that will not go see a doctor, can have a cough for 20 years, joints swollen, and it's like, nah, I'm good. And we don't think about, why won't you go see? And then they might say, Tuskegee, I don't trust the doctors. I don't want to be an experiment. I don't want somebody to say, like, all of that is stemmed in how we were treated, how they were treated, how you have some of our vets that come back from Korean War, Vietnam War, and we never got the help that they needed because they're like, I don't trust it. When we think about that, like that impact and the dismissiveness that they might have faced with other medical professionals who just wrote it off. Like, that's real. The impact of systemic racism and how they're treated isn't going to say, you know what, I'm good here. Don't want to deal with it. I don't think we consider how deep some of that goes and how much it stems back to us being treated as, animals, or being experimented on, and that distrust, and that, nah, I'm all right. This is fine. Everything is fine. Don't worry about me. I got it. My back might hurt. I might not be able to move, but you know what? If I lay down for 5 minutes, I'm going to be all right. That stems from the distrust, because they may have gone to a doctor who may have said, oh, there's nothing wrong with you, or you can tolerate pain more than the next person, and so we're not going to treat that. We think about how our criminal justice system needs a complete overhaul, and how Black men in particular are targeted more by police. And it doesn't matter how well you're dressed, how eloquently you speak. Sometimes they're not going to see you as a person. And understanding that's an impact of systemic racism. Mental health. I don't want to talk to a therapist. I don't need to talk to anybody. I can handle it, and bottling in all of that stress and trauma without having proper access to professionals who could help, because there's, again, that distrust. And then when you have all of these things coupled together, that leads to the potential for family disruptions. So that's breaking down our families due to incarceration, the unemployment, social and emotional issues, health issues, all of these things that we may not think about as being stemmed in the impacts and the legacy of enslavement that has been carried down, how we're in a constant fight or flight, and how we are constantly fighting for our dignity, and how Black men in particular are constantly fighting to be recognized as humans, as productive citizens, as all of these things that, again, those stereotypes say that they can't be, or that they shouldn't be. Like, We got to understand that all of that is, when people are ranting and raving and saying the system, this is exactly what they mean. That takes a toll. That takes a toll on then how they can help their families. It takes a toll on how they can lead their families. Um, if you ever had somebody just talk down to you all day, every day, and tell you what you're not going to be, what you can't be, what you shouldn't be because of who you are, that takes a toll. And that is, that's, it's almost sad to say that's how it's almost always been, but it's cyclical in nature. And how are we going to help not just our men, but our communities overcome this? It's by understanding and acknowledging the why, getting to the root of the why and working through that and saying, okay, but how are we resistant? How are we resilient in these moments? How did we push? How did we keep going? Where was our joy? And where can we find it again? How can I support you as you help build me? How do we preserve our families and our identity and our communities and our culture? Understanding that in some ways we're not meant to exist. That's, the system is literally like, y'all don't deserve to be here. So how do we fight that? But how do we do it in a way where we're lifting each other up and empowering each other instead of letting it break us? Some of that then leads to some of those moments of discord. And we've seen a lot of, you've always seen the conversations on Twitter and whatnot. You've seen the misogyny, you've seen women should be submissive and be quiet. And they should just be docile and sitting there. But some of it is foolishness, but some of it does stem from, again, that trauma and that history that we've not talked about, that need to be able to provide, and that instinct to, nah, I got this and you can't, instead of realizing that we work better together. We need each other. We feed so much into the discord in the roles that somebody should be playing, instead of understanding that everybody plays a position that helps uplift. And a lot of that is based in those historical traumas. It's based in that societal pressure, and it's also based on what you know, what you've seen, what you've been around, who you've been around, their issues, and how that impacts and then carries over to you. And it's not something that, will be healed overnight. It's not something that's going to just go away, but it takes work. And it's understanding, again, where we've been. I always tell people, they're like, I don't understand why this is like this. I don't understand X, Y, and Z. I always go back to, what do you know about your history? What do you know about how we were treated? What do you know about how our communities were treated? What do you know about what happened here, and here throughout our history? Because that helps explain how we ended up in the situations that we're in right now, and how there are systems that were built and designed solely to create that discord. How do we break that? We talk about breaking generational curses. We don't talk about the trauma, and how do we heal from that generational trauma? A lot of it stems in the historic. So, look at me jumping ahead. How do we then talk about, how do we start the process? Because again, it's not going to be an overnight solution. It's not going to be, we're going to sit down one day, just have a conversation, and everything will be better. It's work. And it's important that we acknowledge, first of all, our history and our past. Let's not be ashamed. When we talk about enslavement, let's not be ashamed. I always tell people, the minute that you are ashamed of slavery happening to your ancestors and you survived, you're saying that their existence wasn't worth it. You were saying, and now their situation was crap, hands down, should not have happened. But their will to survive long enough to make the person that made the person that made the person that made you, you shouldn't be ashamed about that, because they were thinking about you. They knew that they would never know you, but they were thinking about you. They were thinking about the hopes and dreams that they had for their life that they wouldn't see that you would be able to have. And the sooner that we acknowledge not just the institution of enslavement, the impact of that institution, and then the people who made that institution, when we acknowledge them as people with thoughts and feelings, dreams and emotions, just like we have, then we start to realize the horrors that were done to them. That helps us understand some of these underlying issues that we have. That allows us to start to heal from a hurt that we didn't experience, but we still feel. Never, I always tell folks when I'm doing interpretation, when I'm doing presentations, never be ashamed of your ancestors, because without their survival for even that slightest bit, you don't exist. When we acknowledge and address that trauma, when we acknowledge and address the system of enslavement, when we acknowledge and address the systemic racism, when we acknowledge and address what has happened to our communities and how our communities thrived in spite of, that's like step one. It hurts, it can be painful, it can be uncomfortable, but ignoring it doesn't help. And once you start to acknowledge and address it, then you can really start to understand what was happening. And you really start to dig in. We talked about resilience and these resilient roots. You start to dig in to see what were their methods of survival? What were their methods of resistance? How can we impart some of those ideals into resisting the oppression that we face today and fighting back? What are the ways that we can push through because they found a small way to? That helps us then open communication to address the conflicts that exist within our community. The why. Things like education, socioeconomic status, colorism, cultural backgrounds. Black folks are not a monolith. We come from all over. The diaspora is wide. Our experiences are not going to be the same. But because kind of been pigeonholed into y'all all look alike and offensive things of that nature, we're not addressing these conflicts that exist within our community. These conflicts that we need to be open and honest about. We need to understand the roots of those conflicts, and we need to come together to figure out, no, we can't be like this. And the respecting of everybody's experiences, and their backgrounds, and how they embrace their Blackness. Like, that is so important, which then leads us to promoting education and awareness about Black culture and history that helps us foster that understanding and respect. That gets us to understand who we are across the globe, what our experiences are, what those cultures are, what that means, and really learn to respect the experiences of others. You don't always have to like it, but understanding that one person's experience is not going to be yours, and the next person is not, and yours is not going to be the next person. I think it's so important. Embracing our differences, embracing the nuance of who we are as a people is something that can really help us understanding our culture better. We want to be able to support our Black-owned businesses and organizations that strengthen communities' economic and social infrastructure. A lot of people that ask me things like, what do you think about reparations? And I'm like, pour that money into communities. Pour it into our communities, into our institutions, and into our businesses. Because I have a hard time with the concept of putting a dollar amount on my ancestor when I know that's what their life was. But if there's a way where we can pour that into scholarship, if we can pour that into education opportunities, if we can pour that into community efforts and organizations and businesses and help uplift and help try to bridge those gaps, that's what we can be doing. And then we really need to be advocating for policies and initiatives that address and tackle social and economic inequalities. Like, we need to be loud. Folks are out here banning books. One person can ban a book from all schools across the country. We need to be loud and acknowledging our history is important and it matters. And we need to talk about it. We need to advocate for financial literacy in our communities. We need to advocate for the importance of planning for your retirement, even if you're 20 years old. Like, why does that matter? We need to be loud about these policies that can help, again, bridge those gaps. Because if, let's be honest, if we don't do it, who else is going to? We need to make sure that as we are fighting these systems and dismantling them to rebuild a better community and to rebuild better, I don't even want to say better systems, but when we're dismantling, we're just creating a better society. We need to be as loud of advocate as we can. We need to have people who can position themselves to push forward change, to push forward the legislation, to push forward these initiatives that can make this happen. It's a lot of work, and it's not something that is going to be done in a generation or two. This is constant work because we are dismantling 3 and 4 generations of trauma, followed by behind 2 and 3 generations of hot mess of what happened to us. We think about I've been talking. So when we think about the resilience and the strength demonstrated by our families and our communities in the face of adversity, yeah, we got to acknowledge that we have been through it as a people. We find a way. We find a way to create better, to have better, to do better. We have shown that we can handle it. We shouldn't have to, but we've shown that we can. And I think that is honestly the strength of our ancestors coming through and telling us, hey, don't give up. We couldn't do it. We couldn't give up. You can't give up. It's like that push forward. And we really, really need to embrace that resilience. That's why I always, again, going back to telling people, don't be ashamed. Somebody fought for you. We got to fight for the next generation and the folks that will never know that we existed. We have to fight for them. We have to persevere, even as we're still facing issues and systems that honestly, how? Why is this still happening? And it's tiring and it's exhausting and it's disheartening a lot of times. But we have to keep pushing through. We know that we can be resilient. We know that it's in us to be resilient. We've got to let that keep going. It's the one thing that we have that we can hope that the next generation and the generation after that has something better. Because guess what? Even though it's a hot mess still, we're in a better place than our ancestors. Progress is slow. Change takes forever. But we see these gradual steps and we keep building that resilience to get to the next level. But like I said, it's exhausting. The world is pretty dark right now, and it's so hard. It's so hard to keep going. So what are the ways in which what are the ways that we can cope? How do we navigate all of this? Self-care is tossed around a lot, but honestly, it's caring for yourself. Do something that helps and works for you. So these healthy habits like exercise, sleep, naps are essential. Rest is essential. Proper nutrition, and then having that support system from your friends, from your family, from a therapist. Ride the wave that is therapy. I know a lot of people are like, oh, well, it's a trendy thing. No, it's people finally realizing I need to talk to somebody that can help me. Having a support system that can hear you, that supports you, that listens to you, but also can give you guidance, largely from a medical professional, but who can give you guidance, that is so essential. And everybody laughs at me when I say take a nap, but proper rest. You never want to get to a point where your body tells you to sit down. You want to be able to sit down willingly. That's when we talk about self-care, because in order to do this work, you have to be present. And it's hard to stay resilient. It's hard to push forward if you're exhausted. I always tell people, take a break, step back. Like, you can't do it all. Mindfulness and relaxation techniques, that deep breathing and reframing negative thoughts, that'll change your life. The simple reframing of a negative thought into seeing the silver lining, seeing the brightness in something, it could change how your day goes, which can change how your week goes, which can change your interactions. It literally can change your life. So it's really, really engaging in that mindfulness, feeding yourself mentally, physically, spiritually, things that will give you light, that will give you joy, that will help you understand, man, yo, it's dark right now. This is rough. But I made it out of bed today. I was able to make somebody smile. This happened to me and it changed my outlook. I had a conversation. Yesterday I came back from vacation and work was whooping me. One phone call from an elder who just had this light in her voice and changed so much. And instead of, man, I got a lot of work to do, it was, okay, so how are we going to do this work? Oh, that simple reframing, that energy, that shift. I mean, it was still a Monday, but it was a better Monday because I decided to focus on that positive. When you're doing all of this work, though, set those realistic goals, prioritize tasks, and practice problem-solving skills that will help you gain a sense of control. I always tell folks, yo, I might complain, but I'm gonna be solution-oriented. I gotta work it out. I gotta push it out. And then it's like, okay, but how do we tackle this? If it's making a list, if it's keeping a calendar, if it's just writing things out, make it realistic. You can have a list that's 100 things long, but if you're like, I can only hit 2 today and maybe 2 next week, guess what? That's 4 things that you will eventually tackle, which then brings your list to 96. Making sure that what you're doing is manageable, making sure that you're not overwhelming yourself, because even when you're prioritizing and setting goals, if you don't hit a mark, it's okay. You have time to do it later. If it means that you got to step back, have that moment of meditation, if you got to breathe deep because you're like, yo, I'm starting to feel anxious. Self-care is taking that nap and saying, I'm gonna lay it down for a second. I need to rejuvenate. I need to start over. I need to hit the reset button real quick. And then seek help when you need it. Even if you think you don't need it, seek help. It's never hurt anybody to get some additional help. And don't hesitate to contact others for support. If you don't have a support system, find a way to build one. And if you do have a support system, but you're like, oh no, I don't want to bother somebody. I can guarantee you somebody in your support system has no problem picking up the phone and calling you and unloading on you. Reciprocate. Make sure that your support system is willing to give and take. Helping each other stay balanced, helping each other stay resilient is super important. We want to build shared communities without the burden of tasks. I know these words are being banned left and right, but inclusivity and diversity really are key. Make sure that everybody's involved in decision-making processes. Let's break down this whole idea of gender roles. If somebody can do the work, let them do the work. Like, be aware to avoid gender stereotypes. Work to create a safe space that's inclusive, not just a safe space, but a brave space and a welcoming environment for all members of your community. I like doing lawn work. My husband doesn't. He'll do it, but he don't like doing it. Most people be like, well, he should be out there. Not if it brings me peace and joy. Then I'll do it. Like break down those stereotypes, break down those roles, and really just say what is your strength? What can you do? How does this fit in what we all need? Great, that's what you're gonna do. You got this, you can do that. Whew. Oh. So we're looking at kind of the history. We've looked at the roles, we've looked at how to support, how to create and build resilience. But intersectionality is that one word that people are like, all of this though weaves together. And intersectionality refers to the understanding that individuals possess multiple identities. They intersect and influence their experiences. I talked way like an hour ago, kind of about that, the hierarchy of the enslaved society, where you have enslavers, a mistress, overseer, a driver, enslaved Black men as artisans, enslaved women and children. Intersectionality is kind of existing in that they are still marginalized. They are still looked down upon, but guess what? They are layered because they are men. So that puts them above women. But when we're looking about intersectionality, we have to acknowledge that Black men might face discrimination based on their race, but they may also thrive in places of employment because they're men. Because we know that men get paid more than women. We know that men are often listened to more than women. And so you have these intersectionalities, like all of these things can exist in the same space. You may come from a literal, he's not a good example, but the theoretical doctor in a lawyer Black household and still be treated as a second-class citizen because of color of your skin. You may be able to have a seat at one table, but not a seat at another. And when we think about intersectionality, it's understanding that your identity isn't just one thing and that you can exist in these various spaces. So when we're thinking about what does that mean and how do we help each other, this is what leads us to understand that Black men can be oppressed, but in the same breath, discount Black women because they know that their role as men allows them a certain level of privilege that a woman may not have. And so, and that's just thinking in binary. So we haven't even hit non-binary and those intersections. But it's understanding that our existence, our identity doesn't tie us to one experience. It puts us in various spaces. So how are we utilizing the wholes of our identity and creating positive change in the various ways in which our identity intersects with socioeconomic status, with race, with gender, with education? How are we using that to help uplift? How are we using that to help others get ahead? And how are we using that as forms of resistance? So intersectionality can highlight the compounding effects of discrimination and oppression faced by Black and minority communities, which then does increase their vulnerability to mental health issues, stress, and emotional distress. Because you can be hit from all sides of your identity, and that can take its toll on you. But then the resilience is influenced by the ability to navigate and challenge those intersecting forms of discrimination, as well as access to support systems and resources that will help us get through. We need to understand, recognize, and acknowledge intersectionality of policies and programs and services. It's essential to fostering those more equitable and inclusive environments because, again, creating diversity and inclusion doesn't just mean we have women, we have Black folks, we have this minority, we have that minority, we're good. I may have somebody who holds multiple identities. How am I making space for those identities at this table? how is this policy maybe impacting one part of their identity in a positive way, but also then impacting them in a negative way here? And how do we make sure that that doesn't happen? How do we really embrace intersectionality in the work that we do and how we help others, which then helps us build resilience? Oh, Lord, I have talked a lot. The one thing that I do, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second. The one thing that I do hope that this did is one, provide you kind of with an understanding of the history of where we are, where we've been, how that has impacted our communities, how that has impacted kind of the lives of Black men through time, but also the ways in which, while we stand in the gap, we also need to acknowledge that we exist in these spaces as well. Understanding that the work always continues, that we need to embrace the resilience of not just our ancestors, but the resilience in us. Knowing and understanding that trauma can be passed down, but it doesn't have to keep getting passed down. But realizing that there has been a genetic shift due to enslavement. What do we do not to get over it, not to get past it, but to acknowledge that and further evolve? How do we support each other? How do we support the men in our lives? How do we support the men in our communities by also understanding that we too need support? And how do we embrace and accept all sides of our identities and continue to lift each other up? And it sounds very cliche, but to fight the good fight. When we think about the resiliency of our roots, we think about how far we've come. Again, I can't help but be in awe of the people who came before me, understanding that they suffered, they triumphed, but they went through so much with somebody, even if it was one person for 1 second or one day, thinking about me, knowing that they would never meet me, knowing I would never know them, and how they fought to ensure that eventually I would exist. When we think about the resiliency of our roots, we think about how far we've come. We need to start thinking about the generations that won't know us moving forward, but we fight for them. We understand and we work to acknowledge how our history has played a role in who we are today, but understanding that it doesn't always have to stay that way. I think it's so important that we consider how our past has shaped us and we reframe how we think about our past as well. Thinking about those that fought to survive so that we could exist is extremely powerful, and it's a strong reframing of who we were as people before and how we were taught to think of ourselves as victims, as less than, as people who couldn't, and instead thinking about their will to survive long enough so that we could be here. To me, that's the resilience in our roots. That is something that I want to keep fostering and watering and growing so that the generations after me understand the reasons why I fought so hard for them, and that they will continue to fight hard for others. So I am going to stop talking. I realized I've been talking for like an hour 10. Are there any questions? Renee, did I do the things that needed to be done?
No, I thought your stuff was perfect, and maybe that PowerPoint presentation that added a little much, but hey, we covered everything. It's like, hey, it's another
Thorough.
slide.
She was thorough. She's like, this is what you said. This is what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we had everything, and I think we did come across everything there. I think I did. Let's see, I have one questions here. So would you recommend any resources or some further reading if people want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the subject of Black men and families in American history?
There's so many resources. Um, there's so many resources. You know what? I would honestly start with, and it's going to sound really weird. It's going to sound strange. You're going to be like, how is this a good resource? But WPA narratives. WPA narratives, honestly, because what those reading those narratives of those individuals who were once enslaved, reading their experiences and the experiences of society around them, honestly, gets you to understand how, when I think about it, how like my great great grandfathers would have been treated. And that leads to a rabbit hole of, okay, well, this is what was happening in this area. Oh, I'm from this spot. Oh, these names sound familiar. Wait a minute. Something about those narratives, it opens up a wormhole. And then I would also look for, again, you're going to say, I don't understand, Nicole, but make it make sense. Lost and found ads from after the Civil War, where you're seeing these men and these women searching for their families and searching to reconnect. You see the drive that some of these men had to find their wives, to find their children, to bring their families together, to um, to have their marriage legally acknowledged. Like, to me, those are the rabbit holes that kind of start off with the, okay, so how did we do this? And then how did we build our schools? And then what do you mean there were 1,500 men who were elected into office? Who were those men? Like, starting in the way back and then moving forward, honestly, to me, is one of those are like my starter resources. Because I could tell you books, you'll fall asleep reading those books. But when you're reading the narratives or when you're looking at those ads and you're hearing their voices and you realize the work that they're putting into finding their sons and their daughters, their wives, their mothers, their fathers, there's something about that. Like, they never gave up. These men fought to rebuild a family that was taken from them. And I think those narratives and those ads are honestly some of the best ways to get started into understanding who we are, and then just kind of trailing up. Because you could read Booker, you could read Booker T, you can read Du Bois, or Du Bois. She said his name is Du Bois. But honestly, those folks whose names that aren't in our history books, start with their stories, start with their histories, and let that guide how you're looking at your communities, and kind of the makeup of your community and the struggles of your community. Look at who was organizing during the movement in your city, state, community, and really understand those struggles. And while they are extremely painful to read about and to see some of the imagery, when you start to research lynching, um, seeing how why these men were attacked. And it's often because they were being successful. They were being they were making change happen. But not just reading about their demise, but how their communities fought back. That resistance piece is something that we don't talk about often. And when a lynching happened, some communities went silent, but other communities fought back. And I think understanding that, how we come together to support the men and the injustice, those I would say are places to start. It really brings home what has happened to us, but also how we always found a way. And it does something. It really does something to make you really consider, all right, if they could do this, what can I be doing?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I did put some of the links there in the chat for the WPA narratives, and
Mhm.
then searching for loved ones and wanted ads with the NPR. So
Yeah.
it's nice. Do we have any other questions? Okay, all right. Well,
All
thank you so
right.
much. I'm gonna go ahead and upload it on YouTube tonight, so you should get another email from me with the funny emails, and I'll have the link to it as well as a link to the presentation if you want to review it. So thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you for everyone else for coming out, in a sense, virtually tonight.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We appreciate y'all. Thanks.
Thank you.